So welcome to all of you. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces and some new faces, so it's good to have you here. This year, the Sunday at the Abbey series, which is a series of 6 presentations this year, is focused on the relationship between biblical faith and its account of creation and the account given to us by molecular science. This evening, we're really pleased to have Dr. Katie Furniss. I think you put the accent on the first syllable, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Furniss, just like the thing.
Yeah. Okay. She is from the CSB and SJU biology department. She in fact grew up in Burnsville, Minnesota, and did her undergraduate work here in biology at the College of St. Ben's and St. John's. Her doctorate is from the University of Minnesota. It's in molecular biology and genetics. She is wrapping up her 9th year here at CSB and SJU and is transitioning to teaching at the University of Minnesota. With the completion of the sequencing of the human genome in 2003, we are more aware than ever of DNA and the language of DNA, and countless families have sent in a slim set of dollars in order to get some piece of genetic information about their own background. So there is some engagement by the public in the work of the genome. But as a molecular biologist and geneticist, Katie is particularly concerned about the study of DNA and the way it shows the way we're, on the one hand, different, but also connected to other species on this planet, and can offer all kinds of reflections. I'm very eager to hear your presentation, Katie, okay? Please, and her presentation this evening is, what does DNA reveal about evolution and relationships? Please give a warm Collegeville welcome.
Okay, so mic's on, can you hear? Good? Okay, good. All right. Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm very excited to be here and talk about this. I have a sort of a variety of, the teacher in me has learning objectives. So only if the computer moves forward. There we go. Okay. So to give you a view of where this is going to be going, the first thing I want to talk about is what is kinship. So we're going to think about it in probably the way that you might think about kinship, and then we'll talk about it from a biological view. And then we're going to move right into evolution. I'm going to talk about some common misconceptions and how that can impact our interpretation. And then into our use of DNA and how that has informed our understanding of evolution. And then wrap it on up with how DNA is currently being used in a couple of different ways that you have probably interacted with it. So as you can see, this is quite the variety of subjects. And as was mentioned, right, my expertise is in molecular biology and genetics. I don't have specific expertise in religion and a variety of other topics that are going to come up today, but genetics has these far-reaching arms that connect to so many different things, that these are things that I have thought about, read about, listened to, but I'm just putting out a disclaimer, have not received a PhD in by any means, okay? So I also intend for this to be very collaborative. So that is the way I teach. I have my students talking to each other and then sharing out, and I'm going to be asking you to do that as well. And we're going to start that out right away. So I want you to think first about, what does kinship mean to you? And then have you share that with your neighbor, and then I'm going to ask for a few volunteers to bravely share with the class. What does kinship mean to you? Okay, so I'm going to give you a minute to think about that and talk to your neighbors. Maybe make a new friend out there, okay? Go.
Brilliant, simple definition.
All right, do we have any brave volunteers that want to share out with the class on what kinship means to you? Okay, so right here, don't worry, I know there's no chalkboard, but I brought my own. Okay, so we heard blood relationship. Hopefully I'm writing fairly large. And I ran out of room. We'll remember. Anybody else? Common origins? Social. And social. Great. Common origins. Right? Kinship can be social.
Positive and negative.
Sure. We all have those kins that we're a little embarrassed of, and I can say that because he's my dad.
I'm not embarrassed of it.
You know, I drove him here, so if he misbehaves, he might be staying here. Okay, so these are some really great things that we already know about kinship. I thought I would bring in a connection then to the rule of Benedict, right? With this idea of relationship, right? Relationship to others. And for me, that is actually very close to the biological definition of kinship. So there is an actual biological definition. So it's co-ancestry. So you can have kinship with others if you share a similar ancestry. Kinship in biology is describing a specific genetic relationship. So that fits in with the co-ancestry part. We can express kinship in mathematical terms, so we can calculate it using equations. I will not be asking you to do that today, so sigh of relief. But lastly is this, these values, this mathematical expression of kinship, it connects humans to other humans, so within our species, and it can also be used to express our connection to other species. Okay, so a lot of these things that you brought up when you thought of kinship already is mirrored in the biological world. So we're going to come back to the idea of kinship a lot, but we're setting our foundation here. So to move on to one of the next major topics, and we're going to see its relationship with kinship, what is evolution? So evolution, by definition, is a change in population over time. So that's probably something you're pretty familiar with. But more specifically is that it's a change in DNA variant frequency in a population over time. Okay, so that got a little bit fancier there, right? All I mean is that, for example, there is a, let's just be sort of general, a variant for the skin color of a moth, right? So the appearance of the moth, right? And if I go there at this moment, maybe the most common color for that moth is going to be white. But some of the moths there have darker colors, right? Gray and on into black. So there's a frequency of white and gray and black, right? If I come back 100 years later, that frequency may not be the same, right? Maybe now there are more gray-colored moths and fewer white-colored moths, okay? So that's the change, right? And we can visually see that change because we would be able to count the number of moths and how many were white and gray and black, right? So we would be able to calculate that change, right? But it's all due to DNA variation, okay? So what we're really doing then is we're measuring how frequent the variant for white or gray or black is. So, oops, too clicky, sorry. If enough of this change accumulates over time, that's how we end up with a new species, right? Because if I come back 100 years later and there's more gray moths, I don't have a brand new species of moth, I just have more gray moths, right? But if these changes begin to accumulate and they accumulate in multiple locations, right, over a certain amount of time, that's when we have speciation. So this is an adorable group of animals here. These are called tenrecs. They live in Madagascar. And they all share one ancestor. But each of these species of tenrec have evolved to fit a certain niche. So on the left, this is a tenrec that lives very well in aquatic environments. It has webbed feet. It has an otter-like tail. So it's wonderfully evolved for that tenrec, for that aquatic environment. Okay? The one in the middle, that's an arboreal tenrec. It has a long prehensile tail, making it well-suited for its forested environment. And then the one on the right is a tenrec that lives underground, like a mole. Okay, so you can see it has a much more pronounced nose, giving it a better sense of smell, diminished eyesight, what you would normally think of when you think of a mole. Okay, so all three of these are different species of tenrec, but they all share the same ancestor. And they have accumulated changes that have led to changes in these adaptations over time, leading to new species. Okay, so this is what evolution is. So what are some misconceptions about evolution? Some misconceptions about evolution is, number one, is the idea that some species are less evolved. Okay, so on the left side here, we have a single-celled organism called Pyrococcus furiosus. Okay, so it's a single-celled organism. In the middle, we have a tardigrade, which is a multicellular organism but is very small. Okay? And on the right, we have a human who is very impressive. If you don't recognize her, this is Simone Biles. She is an Olympic gymnast, and I think she's amazing. Okay? So the misconception is that humans are the most evolved species on Earth and everything else is less evolved. But that's not the case, okay? Because Pyrococcus furiosus lives in the Mariana Trench, okay? It's very hot, it's got a lot of pressure down there, and you would not survive, okay? So they are well suited and adapted for their environment, right? Tardigrades are very fun. They're also called water bears. They're very cute. But they can actually are known to be able to survive the radiation and vacuum of space and be able to survive that and still live. Okay? So again, they are amazing organisms and we would not live in that environment. Okay? So there's no sort of more or less evolved. That's not the way we think about species. We think about species as being how well suited they are to their environment or not. Okay? So that's a misconception we don't want to have. The second misconception is that individuals can evolve. And I blame this one mostly on the way that we colloquially use the term evolve, right? I read all these books about sleep training, and I've really evolved my thinking on the subject, right? So we're using the term evolve in that way just as change, right? My thoughts have changed, my beliefs have changed, I've evolved, right? But that's not how biology uses the term, okay? The only way evolution happens in biology is by looking at that frequency of colors, right? Let's go back to those moths, right? How frequent were the black moths, the white moths, the gray moths, right? In that population. A moth that is white cannot all of a sudden be like, ooh, gray would be really great, right? And turn gray. That's not how it works, okay? So individuals are what they are, but the population can evolve, right? So in my fun cartoon here, which I have my introductory students have to analyze and tell me what did this fish get wrong. Well, this fish thought that it could evolve being able to breathe air and walk on land, right? So it held the misconception that individuals can evolve. They can't, so it died, right? So now the third misconception is something I will get to, but I want you to think first about relationships, right? So there's a couple variety of terms on here, right? There's you, okay? And you had a mother and a father, right? Grandmas and grandpas. Maybe you had a sibling and some cousins. So I realize many of you didn't bring a piece of paper, but I see some of you did, right? Could you sketch out your relationship to these others, right? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to maybe write those out.
Do you write all the siblings down?
No, just write one. Just go with one, yeah. So, because you'll have the same relationship to all, well, you'll have the same ancestral relationship to all of them. We won't get back to that whole positive and negative thing, right? Okay, so just think about how you have a relationship, your ancestral relationship with this group of individuals, as well as yourself. You can just write in the blank sibling, father. You don't have to, unless you want to give them a name. Okay, so before I give you the answer, let's do the misconception. So the third and last misconception I want to address is this idea of evolution as a great chain of being. So this connects to the one at the very beginning of less evolved, more evolved. So if you have the misconception that evolution is a great chain of being, you might draw an evolutionary relationship like this. But this is clearly wrong, right? You did not descend from your sibling, and you did not descend from your cousin, right? So this is not the way that you would have drawn your ancestral relationship, right? Instead, you and your sibling share a common ancestor, otherwise known as your parent. Okay, so this is the accurate way to draw the relationship, and this is exactly what an evolutionary cladogram looks like. So you and your sibling share the same ancestor, your parents, okay? Your cousins share their ancestor, let's say their aunt, well, your aunt, their mom, okay? And then all of you share the same ancestors of grandparents, okay? So in this way, you're not showing the incorrect view of you descending from a sibling, right? You and your sibling have the same relationship to your parent. Also, you have an identical relationship to both cousins, right? Even though, you know, maybe this one's Mary and this one's Sue. You're not actually closer relationship with Mary, right? It's an equal one with both. So the reason I wanted to start with this analogy is because we're very familiar with evolution being drawn in newspapers and magazines like this. This is the great chain of being, right? If you were to think of evolution this way, you would think of evolution as if you descended from a chimp. But you didn't, right? You and a chimp share a common ancestor that is neither human nor chimp. Okay, just as you and your sibling shared a common ancestor, right? So this idea of a great chain of being is not an accurate way to express this relationship. Okay? It also tends to have the same, to reinforce that misconception we talked about earlier of more evolved or less evolved, right? If this is our view of evolution, then we are more evolved than chimps, right? But that's not the case, right? Yes?
About first cousin and second cousin.
Well, I just drew two cousins on there as if your aunt had two children.
Okay.
If you wanted to go to second cousins, you would have to go backwards more. We'd have to have great-grandparents and then coming off this direction. So, what does DNA tell us about these evolutionary relationships? So when you think of the picture that we were just talking about, right, DNA would tell us that you and your sibling, right, share 50% on average of your DNA, right, and you and your parents share on average 50% of your DNA. And as you move over to grandparents and cousins, you're sharing less of a percentage, right? So DNA can inform our understanding of how close different species are. So now we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about species. So DNA is a relatively new technology in the grand world of drawing evolutionary cladograms. That's what these fancy things are called, cladograms. And they have changed some things. So before we had DNA, hippos, okay, their closest relative was believed to be pigs, because hippos and pigs look a lot alike, right? So physical features, behaviors, these things seemed very similar. So the logical conclusion was that they shared a recent ancestor, that they were closely related. So DNA came along and the tree was rewritten. What we now know based on shared similarity of DNA is that the closest living relative of a hippo is actually a whale. Surprising, right? So when we look at their physical features, we wouldn't think hippos and whales. They have a lot of things in common, right? But that is what DNA has shown us, is that hippos and whales actually do have a lot of things in common. And the pigs actually got downgraded twice. I mean, it depends on your view. Maybe the pigs think they upgraded. I don't know. Right? So now the hippos have their most closest relative with whales, and then ruminants, and then pigs moving backwards. So DNA has changed our understanding of evolutionary relationships. So what else has DNA changed for us? So bringing us back to this perspective of kinship, and this is actually a quote I took from Dr. Neil Shubin, and I'm just going to read it because I think it's great, and I couldn't think of a way to say it better. So when we look at other critters, we understand much more about ourselves. We understand how our cells work, how our cells divide, and how they die. The trick of understanding much of cancer means understanding other creatures. And this is true because of our evolutionary kinship, because we share so much of our DNA with fruit flies. This is what he's referring to as a worm, but the scientific term is actually C. elegans, and then fish. So this fish has cancer. Well, they gave it cancer. But so the reason that much of our scientific work begins in these model organisms is because of our evolutionary relationship with them, because of our kinship, the fact that we share so much similar DNA with these organisms, right? And it's much easier for us to test on them and much more ethical than humans, right? So we have this shared kinship. So that was a heavy topic. I'm going to pause and let you guys think about questions, enjoy my humorous evolution joke. And then also, if you don't have questions, to think about how does evolution connect to your understanding of kinship that you already showed up with. So I'll pause, let you think of some questions, and then I'll open that up. Yes, I was certain somebody had to have a question. I couldn't go through all of that without. So those three. Oh. See, he didn't know I was going to be doing questions in the middle.
Going back to those three pictures of the animals, and one had a tail hanging.
Sure.
Okay, those three had a common ancestor. Mm-hmm. How did the change happen?
That's a really great question. So briefly, because this would take me several days to discuss in class, okay, how do you get the changes, right? How did we end up with a tenrec that has an otter tail, a tenrec with a prehensile tail, and presumably the mole one? I don't actually know, but probably not much of a tail. So evolution occurs with small changes, but they're random. So mutations occur randomly in our genome, okay? Most of the time, they are not beneficial or have no effect. So most of the time, these mutations are either negatively impacting or they're having no consequence. But every once in a while, right, a mutation will occur that does provide a benefit to that organism. And the benefit has to be focused on ultimately on reproduction. Because what we ultimately need to do is to pass on that mutation to the next generation. So this mutation can either make them faster so they don't get eaten, or better camouflaged, or they can find food better, right? There's many different ways that it could be beneficial, right? But ultimately, it would provide some sort of benefit that would make them produce more offspring than, say, the tenrec next to them, okay? So if you're a tenrec and you're a small mammal, you probably would be delicious for larger animals, right? So you can imagine that there's a variety of potential solutions, right? You could get off the floor and up in the trees, right? Or you could be able to hide in the water, or you could go underground, right? So all these tenrecs have ultimately resulted in what seems to be very beneficial solutions to not being eaten, right? So a tenrec with a slightly longer tail than its neighbor is probably less likely to fall out of the tree, right? Which means it's more likely to have babies and pass on its slightly longer tail to the next generation, right? And so evolution is random, but natural selection, which is one of the ways evolution can occur, works with those differences between individuals. No two individuals are alike, and natural selection will favor the individual that is better suited and adapted and more reproductively successful, therefore, for its environment. So in the case of tenrecs, it would happen quite slowly. It really depends on how quickly you reproduce. So bacteria can evolve wonderful traits that are very beneficial to them in a few days, which is why antibiotic resistance is so problematic. It's very easy. So I don't want to give the impression that evolution has to take a long time. It can happen quite rapidly depending on your species. Other questions about evolution, kinship? Yeah. I want to make sure we're feeling good about this before we move deeper.
Given that we're so close to the fruit fly, would we then consider ourselves to be kins with the fruit fly in this?
So at the very end, I'm going to show you a tree of life that expresses your relationship to all living organisms. So humans, at some distance, have a relationship with every living thing on Earth to some level. So kinship expresses how close that relationship is. So with fruit flies, if you think of the grand scheme of all the species on Earth, we actually have a very close relationship with them. We share about 60% of our DNA with fruit flies. So, so you're not as cool as you think you are unless you think fruit flies are pretty cool. And then you are, okay? So you shares a lot of similarities with everything on Earth. So one of the major things being is that we all use a DNA code. Every living thing on Earth uses DNA, right, as its storage of information. That right there tells us that we all had an ancestor, right, a shared ancestor that was using DNA, right? So yeah, it's pretty cool. All right, here we go. We're going to dive in deeper. So I want to make a connection, and we're going to discuss what evolution and DNA and how this connects to race. But before I do that, I want us to stop and think about what is race, and how do you know to which race you belong or somebody else belongs? So it's one of these things that has become part of our lives, but very rarely have we thought about defining it, okay? So I'm gonna pause again, in case you haven't noticed, lots of pauses for you to think, okay, process. What is race, right? So not what race do you identify as, but how do you know that that's the race that you identify as? What criteria are you using? All right, so we'll get our new piece of paper here. What is race? How do you know? So what criteria do most people use to determine race? Okay, so skin color is the number one way that people use to determine race. Any others? Look at you coming out with the blood. Well, I'm pretty sure that by looking at somebody, you probably couldn't figure out what their Rh factor is. Hair, okay, bone structure. Great, so hair, oftentimes color and texture. Bones, many times people refer to like facial bones, so facial structures. Yes, these are all the common ways that people use to determine race. And as we're discussing here, one of the big questions that people often have, because things like skin color, hair texture, your bones, they have a genetic component to them, right? So no matter how much time I spend out in the sun, I will not get much darker than I am right now, right? And that is because of my genetics. There is some of an environmental factor, because if I do go out in the sun, I will have a darker skin color than I do right now. But mostly this is a genetic thing. So these things that we use to determine race seem like they have this genetic view. So many people then have this view that race is biological, right? That there is a genetic component to it. So, oh, whoops, I forgot to make my point before I moved on to the next slide. Whoopsies. So I have a picture of these two women up here, right? And by the criteria that we've defined here, they have a very similar skin color. They have very similar, well, you can't see it necessarily in the woman on the left, but a very similar hair texture, bone features. And so many people would probably say that these two women are from the same race, right? We might call them African or black, right? However, these two women, the one on the left is from Africa, and the one on the right, for those of you behind this podium, is Australia Aboriginal, okay? So they, just in distance of the world, are very far apart, okay? But, and as we'll talk about much more, these colors on here, so it goes from, for those of you behind the podium, from green in Africa up to blue in Asia, and then Australia is red. So that color coding is depicting the distance genetically. So even though, based on our criteria, we said these two women would be from the same race, genetically, they are actually at the opposite ends of the spectrum for humans. So we're going to talk about this. So what really is happening is that race is not actually based on genetics and ancestry, despite how we commonly think of it, right? Rather, it's based on cultural identity, but also just visuals that we use, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind as we are starting to consider this more. Now, much like kinship and evolution, race has an actual biological definition, okay? So in biology, race is defined by two groups being the same species, but they are reproductively isolated. So individuals in this group are not reproducing with individuals in this group, but they are still the same species. Okay, so this is our term for it in biology. Okay, so in biology, there are animals in the animal kingdom that meet this criteria, right? Same species, but their two groups are not reproducing together, so we consider them races within their same species. However, based on this definition, you're probably thinking that is not accurate for humans, right? We don't have this reproductive isolation in humans. Okay, now I will grant you that, let's go back a few hundred years before airplanes, okay? That a person in the southern tip of Africa is not likely to reproduce with somebody in northern Europe, right, if we go back before airplanes. But somebody in northern Europe could absolutely reproduce with somebody a little further south, and they could reproduce with somebody a little further south, and on and on and on, right? So that even though people at the extremes are not likely to reproduce, there's no isolation or barrier, right? Genetics, DNA is flowing between these human populations. So for a long time, right, humans have never been reproductively isolated. And in fact, you can even see that in our colors, right? Because we only go, most of the Earth is only green or blue in this genetic distance. Australia is red because, of course, they did experience some periods of isolation when we weren't crossing the ocean. So they have accumulated more genetic distance, okay? But not enough to be considered, and not for long enough to be considered an actual different race. So in humans, using our biological definition of race, there are no races in humans, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, and I'm pretty sure that is just what I said. Yes, okay, should have clicked the button. However, as we were just discussing up front here, right, race, while not biological, is real, right, in many ways. So I just want to do a brief history here of science and scientific racism, okay, because it's important and connected to our topic. So in the 19th century, naturalists were running around and categorizing everything, okay? How are these things similar? How are they different? Therefore, how can I express these relationships? And they were just classifying everything. It was just a bonanza for the naturalists at this time. And not surprisingly, they did the same thing with humans. So they took human groups and they classified these groups. So they took a group and they said, well, individuals in this group have these characteristics, right? And they were then assuming that if they just grabbed somebody off the street and they measured them, that they would be able to put them into a group, right? Well, they meet this group's criteria, therefore they're part of that group, okay? So naturalists were making this assumption that these visible traits could be used to define human populations, okay? They also drew, and this was a very popular book at the time, Types of Mankind. It was printed in 1856, so right in the middle of our time period. And they drew these pictures at the time that expressed a very number of common misconceptions, right? So one, you can see here that in the middle, this individual, right, which we would refer to as African, their skull shape as drawn, okay, is an intermediate between what would be European and a chimpanzee, right? So they would have been measuring skulls and said, well, I can determine if an individual is African because I can measure their skull, they'll meet these criteria, and I can put them into that group. I'm hoping what you're also noticing on this picture is one of those misconceptions we talked about earlier, right? Which is the idea of the great chain of being and less evolved individuals, right? So this picture is certainly describing that. So this type of work in the 19th century by very famous naturalists, well-renowned naturalists, led to this view that Europeans were more evolved humans and all other humans were less evolved, right? And unfortunately, this use of science and evolution would have led to this dehumanization, right? If Africans are less evolved humans, right, then they don't deserve the same rights as Europeans, who are the most evolved humans, right? So it leads to a dehumanization of entire groups, okay? Now, this would have been socially acceptable in the 1800s. You could have gone out anywhere and said this, and it would have been socially acceptable. But its impacts remain today. And so I'm going to read the piece at the top here. This was research just done in 2015, and I'm assuming that's too small for most of you. So at the top, it says, people can vary in how human-like they seem. Some people seem highly evolved, whereas others seem no different than lower animals. using the image below, indicate using the sliders how evolved you consider the average member of each group to be. Okay, so on the right, this would have been given the score of 100, maximum evolution, right? On the left, this would have been given a score of 0, okay? 0 evolution, right? And then you were asked to rate, and the groups here are listed as Americans, Arabs, Canadians, Chinese, Europeans, and Muslims. So one individual on the sliding scale. Remember, this is 2015. Now, they did it with a number of groups, but this table here is showing how Americans view all of these other groups, okay? So Americans, on average, viewed other average Americans to be 91.5. So they weren't giving Americans fully evolved, okay, but they were, just a little bit back. In fact, Americans, much like we were just discussing, viewed Europeans to be the most evolved at 91.9 average score, okay? And there's no, you don't need to go through all the numbers because presumably you don't care, but they viewed Swiss, Japanese, French, Australian, Austrian, and Icelander. There was no statistical difference between their view of those groups' evolution and their view of Americans' evolution. And then things change, okay? So we can see here that Chinese were given the average score of 88.4, and then moving on down, South Korean at 86.9, Mexican immigrant at 83.7, Arab at 80.9, and lastly, Muslim at 77.6. So on the grand scale, Americans were putting Muslims at this spot here, right? This would be about 75. Okay, so there's a statistically significant difference, a very large significant difference, between how evolved Americans thought Americans were and Europeans, and how evolved they thought these other groups were. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing that very clear connection between those 19th century naturalists, what message they were sending out, what misconceptions about humans and evolution they were sharing, and consequences that are still prevalent today, okay? So this is a major issue of how science is being used. So how does our use of DNA to understand human genetic diversity fit into this earlier history? So the reason I brought this up is because as scientists are working on understanding human genetic diversity today, we need to keep in mind what message we are sending and how things are being framed because of this historical framework that still is affecting perceptions today. Okay, so this study of human diversity is a tricky way to communicate. So I can talk to other scientists in a way that I would not talk to the general public, no offense, guys, okay? Because of my wanting to be very thoughtful and clear about how I communicate. Okay, we're going to be cycling back to this, but I want to make sure that you understand how we use DNA. So to interject this in here. Everybody has their own unique sequence, right? Your DNA sequence is unique to anybody else. Even twins start to accumulate differences once they're no longer sharing the same cells, okay? So the fancy word here that we're using is alleles. So an allele is any spot in the genome where there is a difference, okay? So the majority of the spots on here are identical, and then right here we have a difference between individual 1 and 2, okay? So if I put a third individual up, okay, I could say how closely related I thought this individual was to individual 2 and 3 to 1. Now, presumably by looking at this, you would think that individual 3 is more closely related to individual 2, right? Because they both share this difference right here, okay? So, and you would be correct. So good job, right? Woo! So just as we've been talking about with kinship and our definition of kinship, right? Individuals with more similar DNA share a more recent ancestor and therefore have a closer relationship. Now, this is pretty easy to do if you're only looking at about 10 nucleotides. You have 6 billion. So we use computers, okay? And computers take these sequences, and what they look for is called maximum alignment. So they will test all possible alignments, and they will look for the one that gives the maximum number, as we're just about to get right here, okay? So they took the two sequences, and at 7 positions out of 9, right, they were identical. So you can do this across many more than this, right, because computers are powerful, and calculate that kinship value that we have been talking about, right? How closely related two individuals are. So the computers do that for us, thank goodness. And using the DNA and these alignment tools, other scientists like Dr. Sarah Tishkoff have identified 14 ancestral populations. So there's a couple of things I want to point out on this picture. Each color represents a different ancestral population. And what I'm hoping you'll notice is that there are many colors in Africa, and there are much fewer colors outside of Africa. This reflects the fact that humans evolved and originated in Africa. So the majority of our genetic diversity is there. Okay? So humans evolving in Africa is sort of this, has been confirmed by this DNA. So what Dr. Tishkoff has done then is she's gone back to these individuals living in these areas, okay, and looked at their genetic composition as compared to these ancestral populations. And so this is sort of the picture. So she's showing right, that individuals native to South Africa, right, they have a variety of ancestral populations present. And that's what we generally see for all of them, right? Even though some of us get pretty close to being only one group. But this is showing us, again, the same thing that we've talked about, is that humans like to do two things. They like to move and migrate, and they like to reproduce, okay? So again, hitting home that fact that there's no line that can be drawn to say this is one group and this is a different group, okay? So what this shows us then, right, is historically, right, if you're in the same geographic region, you're more likely to be genetically similar. But, right, we don't have these mono groups of just one color because of this migration and reproduction, okay? So now that we are not limited to walking, right, now that we can hop on an airplane and fly anywhere and start reproducing there, right, the maximum migration, what does this mean now for our globe-trotting world? All right, something to think about. Yeah?
You made a point earlier about Australia being kind of its own thing. Why is that not represented on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why isn't Australia on here? I can think of 2 reasons. Okay, one is because they are at a distance, they would not be considered an ancestral population. Their ancestral population would have originated in Indonesia. Okay, so they probably don't have an ancestral population. Second one is she might just not have been allowed to sequence anybody from there. Okay, so getting permission to collect samples from individuals is a very large challenge for any geneticist. It's a good question, though. I suppose I'll have to give it to you, Dad. Okay. So as I was saying, right, we have a relatively recent ancestor. So all humans, right, we can track our shared ancestor back to only 170,000 years ago. On the grand scale of living organisms, not very long ago. Secondly, sometime in that past, we had a very rapid decrease in the number of humans on the planet, right? And so what both of these two pieces mean is that on the grand scale of things, humans have very little genetic diversity when we compare ourselves to, say, our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. So 2 chimpanzees have much more difference genetically than any 2 humans on the planet. okay? And that, as I said, right, is because of our relatively recent ancestor. And then secondly, anytime you have a massive decrease in number, okay, you're gonna lose some diversity, right? There's fewer people reproducing, so fewer variations. So what genetic diversity we do have, as I touched on earlier, most of that is actually found in Africa. So that's the maximum source of genetic variability. And that is because that is our origin. And also, whenever humans left, they left in small groups of 100 or so people. That's what they think anyway. And 100 people, there's not going to be a lot of diversity represented there. So as individuals migrated out, they didn't take that much diversity with them. So other parts of the world outside of Africa have even less genetic diversity present. Okay? So coming back to this picture in our discussion of humans and genetic diversity and race, right? As we've touched on, just as a reminder, I'm going to start building connections in here, right? We use physical traits like skin color, hair, to determine race, okay? However, those particular traits really don't tell us very much about our genetic relationship with others. So if two individuals look a lot alike to our eyeballs, okay, that may not, and they're not actually, they're not actually your sibling, right? They're just some random person on the street that looks a lot like you. They may not actually be that closely related to you genetically. You may have somebody that has a different skin color that is actually more genetically closely related. So don't be scared. I'm about to put some numbers up, okay? So I told you earlier that we have 6 billion base pairs in our genome, okay? Any two individuals on the planet, on average, are 99.9% identical at those 6 billion base pairs, okay? So there's only a 0.1% difference, and that 0.1% sounds super small, right? So the person that you're looking at next to you, right, 99.9% similar. But if I take 0.1% and I multiply it by 6 billion, that is 3 million. That sounds big now, right? So then there is diversity present in our species, okay? So there are differences between us and our neighbors. But, it's all your perspective on if you want to think about 0.1% or think about 3 million. However, most of this 0.1%, most of that 0.1% is actually found between individuals that are in the same, as we would consider, group. Okay, so if I took and I compared two Italians to each other, okay, those 3 million differences, we would be able to find most of those differences just between two Italians, right? So most of the diversity in humans we can find within our group. So that remaining numbers, if we look at two unrelated individuals, but they're not in the same group, but they're near each other, like Italy and Ireland, okay, then that's where we find 150,000 more of those differences. And then lastly, if we look at two individuals in very different clusters, notice I'm not calling them races, okay? Right? So if you took someone from Europe and the Middle East, right, and we were focusing on just this 0.1% difference, okay, we would only get about 0.005% of the difference would be found in that, okay? So moral of the story is most of the genetic diversity is found within a population, okay? So again, this genetic relationship is challenging. All right, I just hit you with a lot there. Okay. I also realize that it's 7:58, and I haven't done the last part of the talk yet. She's like, keep going. There's multiple of you nodding at me that want me to keep going. Should I keep going, Brother Paul? Where are you?
It's the abbot's choice, always.
Yeah, I promise there's not. We've gotten through like more than 75%. Yes, question first.
I'm judging this from popular media and just reading,
Great.
It seems like there's an ongoing debate of whether all human, you have the picture of Africa, whether there was one genetic couple, one common ancestor, or there's like a spontaneous development, at least if I understand correctly from the latest, spontaneous development in different parts of Africa, then also in Europe and stuff like that. Is there any, is the jury still out on that?
So Homo sapiens evolved, well, all hominids evolved in Africa, right? And then would have migrated out. So that's what the DNA is telling us. So I'm thinking option one based on what you described. Yes. Other questions? Okay. So to get into some of the ways that you might on the daily interact with all this stuff I just talked about, okay? So there are differences between clusters, right? There are 150,000 base pairs difference, right? Can we use that to do things, right? So I'm going to guess at least, well, maybe not in this group. I was going to say half of you have done an ancestry test, but maybe not real big in the monastery. Okay, so less than half, but I bet you all maybe know somebody who has done it, okay? So just real briefly, what is it? So you go to a company like 23andMe and you order your kit, okay? It shows up, you swish some stuff around in your mouth and you spit it in there that has your cells with your DNA in it, you mail it, and they send you back something that looks like this, okay? And so it's giving you a breakdown by percentage of your ancestry. So this individual is saying that they're 47.4% European and 41.8% East Asian Native American, right? So that's what it's saying. I want to talk more about that, but how do we get those percentages? So we get those percentages because they use these things called reference panels. So they have individuals that are part of their reference panel, okay? So how do you get to be part of the reference panel? Well, you have to be able to have a paper trail that proves your family history has been only from this one area for a number of generations back. I don't know the number of generations because they keep that private, okay? But there has to be some sort of paper trail that shows my family's only been from here, so I am native whatever, okay? Then they send in their own DNA, this reference panel person, okay? And that DNA has to be similar enough to their other reference panel people from that area. So if you say, I'm Italian, I've been living in Italy all my life, my parents are Italian, their grandparents, great-grandparents, right? I'm Italian, I've got this paper trail. And you send in your DNA and you don't look like the other Italians, and by look like, I mean by DNA look like, they are not part of the reference panel, okay? So it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy on what an Italian DNA looks like. So they have these reference panels, and then they're going to take your DNA as the customer, and they're going to compare you to those people in the reference panel. So remember that alignment thing, right? They're doing that with your DNA to all those people in the reference panel. So if you match up in a certain spot, they will give you a certain percentage Italian or whatever it might be. I love that I'm using Italian. I'm not actually Italian in any way, shape, or form. You know. But I want you to take a look at this reference panel. Okay, so this was 2019 Ancestry DNA. That's one of the groups that does this. They have 60 regions in the world for which they have reference panels, and in all total, they have about over 40,000 individuals that are part of their reference panel. What I'm hoping you're noticing here is one thing is that there's some very large blank regions, okay? And actually, up until just 2019, they didn't have anything from Australia, and there are massive other ports that were missing. So they are obviously working at it. The second part, and I realize you probably can't see these numbers, and so I'll read them to you, is the number of individuals they have for any one of these regions. So Germanic Europe, which is right here, okay, has 2,126 individuals part of their reference panel. Indigenous Americas North, which is not only this dark green spot, but it actually goes all the way up there and over and back down. So it includes this light green area as well, also has about 2,290 individuals. So similar numbers in these regions, and yet the regions are not similar in size, okay? The numbers get even worse if you're looking at regions of Africa and much of Asia, where they have very few individuals part of their reference panel, okay? They have a lot of individuals for Europe, all the different parts of Europe. The other interesting thing to think about as you look at these is that they're calling these regions after countries, right? France, Germany. Well, those countries haven't always been there. Those borders haven't always been there. And certainly humans, as we have discussed, do not stick within borders, right? The migrating and the reproducing part. So there's some issues with this reference panel portion. Additionally, and as I was just referencing to, all of this research on human genetic diversity and connections to disease and treatments and all of these things, the vast majority has been done in Europeans. So 78.39% of individuals in these studies of genetic diversity and genetic causes for disease and treatment are European, okay? Not surprising, because of course these are the countries that have the facilities where the scientists are located, and the scientists have access to Europeans, right, that will take these tests. So it's not surprising that we see this, but it's also certainly problematic, especially as I've already told you, Africa contains most of human genetic diversity, and it's 2% of individuals in these populations. So there's a huge issue going on with our understanding of human genetic diversity, its connections to ancestry, disease testing, and whatnot, because we have this huge skew towards Europe. I want you to make that connection maybe in your brain back to that 19th century, right, view of Europeans and so on, right? And what are those continued consequences? See, I was going to pause and ask questions here, but like, we're already over time. And I only have a few slides left, so let's punch through it, right? We're going to have questions at the end for anybody that is a diehard that wants to stick around. So Europeans have been using ancestry testing because many Europeans or Caucasian Americans, right, have lost our ancestry. I can randomly say like German and Irish and stuff, but I don't really know, right? I don't have that information. And so Europeans have been using this type of thing because they're curious, right? People with European ancestry. Native Americans have not been using ancestry testing. So it's interesting to think about how different groups interact with this. Native Americans haven't lost their ancestry or had it stolen from them. They have very clear paper records and oral records of their ancestry going many generations back. So they have very little interest in ancestry testing. Their membership as part of a tribe has nothing to do with DNA. You have to be able to establish your ancestry the old-fashioned way by paper. And then lastly, they are very wary of participating in any genetic testing because of the way scientists have treated them historically as living individuals, but also their artifacts and their family remains, right, have been dug up and taken and used by geneticists in the past. So they're not interested in this ancestry testing. African Americans have also had a very interesting relationship with ancestry testing. So unlike Europeans who have lost their ancestry, African Americans had it stolen, right? So they were captured and forced over into America and have lost that ancestry of where they have come from. This group is probably one you have not heard of. It does ancestry testing. This is a group called African Ancestry. It was started by Dr. Rick Kittles, who's an African-American male, but he's also a leader in the field of ancestry testing and one of the pioneers. So African-Americans are using ancestry testing to find their heritage, okay? But their responses to the results can be quite different. So the commercials you see are often like, I thought I was Irish and it turns out I'm Welsh, right? Oh, this is so fun. I'm gonna find out all about the Welsh heritage. It's African Americans, according to their own verbal story, some can find it very revealing and they want to make connection to their African ancestry. Others may find out that they don't have as much African ancestry as they thought, and that can be very challenging to their story of what their race is and their perspective of themselves. And so you can, I've listened to a number of oral responses to individual results, and you can hear things like, am I not black enough now, right? What does this mean? You know, how do I have so little African ancestry, but I identify as a black male, right? So there can be some very different responses. So direct-to-consumer, which is what all of this stuff is called, Ancestry, DNA, 23andMe, it's all direct-to-consumer genetic testing, is skyrocketing, okay? So this was the most recent figure I could find, even though it's a year old, that there would be about 26 million consumers in 2019, and that skyrockets up to 100 million by 2021. One of the questions then to think about is, what is happening to all of this DNA sequence? This is information about 100 million people very shortly, okay? What is happening? So African ancestry actually gets rid of the sample that was sent in as well as the data once they send it to the customer. They do not maintain that information in part of their database. They have their reference panel, but other than that, they don't keep it. 23andMe and Ancestry.com and all those places, they do maintain that sequence, and they use it either themselves to pursue pharmaceutical research and disease and patents, or they can actually sell that genetic information to other companies that are researching those things. And that's actually what they're really into it for, okay? So why? Why would you do this? How does this connect to diseases? So sickle-cell disease, right, is a disease you probably have heard about, right? It can lead to hemophilia, and there's a variety of issues. And it's very common in African Americans and not very common in Hispanic Americans. So if you're a clinician and two patients arrive and they have the same symptoms, but one is African American and one is Hispanic American, does their race affect your diagnosis, right? So you're probably thinking, well, yeah, like, you know, using race in this diagnosis can help me get to a faster diagnosis, a more accurate diagnosis. It can help me rule out something that's not very likely, right? So there's a lot of reasons that you can think of that using race in disease diagnosis would be highly relevant. However, sickle cell disease, as shown here in red, not only is it prevalent in Africa, but it's actually also found in the Middle East and in India, and even here, just sort of in this northern, or right here in the Mediterranean here, okay? The reason being is because these areas are common for malaria. So having one version of the sickle cell disease is actually an evolutionary advantage to individuals living in these areas. And so it's actually quite beneficial. But I'm going to let Dorothy Roberts tell us some issues with this. So this is just a short clip.
15 years ago, I volunteered to participate in a research study that involved a genetic test. When I arrived at the clinic to be tested, I was handed a questionnaire. One of the very first questions asked me to check a box for my race: white, black, Asian, or Native American. I wasn't quite sure how to answer the question. Was it aimed at measuring the diversity of research participants' social backgrounds? In that case, I would answer with my social identity and check the box for black. But what if the researchers were interested in investigating some association between ancestry and the risk for certain genetic traits? In that case, wouldn't they want to know something about my ancestry, which is just as much European as African? And how could they make scientific findings about my genes if I put down my social identity as a Black woman? After all, I consider myself a Black woman with a white father rather than a white woman with a Black mother, entirely for social reasons. Which racial identity I check has nothing to do with my genes. Well, despite the obvious importance of this question to the study's scientific validity, I was told, don't worry about it, just put down however you identify yourself. So I checked Black, but I had no confidence in the results of a study that treated a critical variable so unscientifically. That personal experience with the use of race in genetic testing got me thinking, where else in medicine is race used to make false biological predictions? Well, I found out that race runs deeply throughout all of medical practice. It shapes physicians' diagnoses, measurements, treatments, prescriptions, even the very definition of diseases. 15 years.
So Dorothy Roberts, right, we would, according to our list, right, have characterized her as Black, and she self-identified that way as well. But as we've been talking about, that is not a genetic term, right? It's not something that reveals anything about her genetic identity. In fact, the average African American has at least 25% European DNA, right? So if she has a African American mother and a white American father, she's probably 50% or more with European ancestry. And so if she walks into the doctor's office, right, and herself and her doctor would probably identify her as Black, how does that affect her diagnosis, right? Because commonly we're using race as a proxy for genetics, right? We're using race to tell us something about our DNA, but it doesn't tell us anything about our DNA. Well, not anything, that might be a little extreme. As a scientist, I can't go that far, right? So this is particularly problematic in the Western Hemisphere where we've had all of this, reproducing, okay? Another example then is hypertension. Okay, hypertension is incredibly common among African Americans, much more so than it is in white, okay? And there's a lot of research currently happening on the genetic cause. So what is different about African Americans than white Americans on why the increase in prevalence of hypertension? So the thing I want to caution about this then is that this is leading us to this idea of genetic deficiency, right? That African Americans are genetically deficient, right? They carry some sort of mutation that leads to this increase in prevalence for hypertension. When in all reality, what we know to be the #1 cause of hypertension is diet, okay? So what we're really looking at here is a connection between socioeconomic status and the experience of racism and how that is leading to this increase in hypertension, okay? That is really the thing. Secondly, is that African Americans are actually prescribed a different pill. Again, because of this belief that there is a genetic difference, okay, that is leading to this difference in response. And you can go down a whole wormhole, or what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, you all know it, right? On Bidil. Okay, so if you want to look up Bidil, that will lead you, right, in a whole direction that we don't have time to go into, as I'm already way over. The last one, because we've talked about diagnosis and we've talked about testing, is this idea of precision medicine. So DNA, this view that every one of us could be treated as an individual, right? That we will get our treatment, our diagnosis based on our DNA, right? That is the dream, okay? But In this example here, we have glomerular filtration rate, which sounds fancy, but it's just how good is your kidney working, right? An individual that's identified as black has a different equation to figure out their GFR rate as compared to any other non-black. The reason for and this is like in the medical textbook, right? This is what doctors are supposed to use, or if they use a computer and they type in their patient's racial identity and these values, it will use the equation connected to their racial identity. Right? So it's not even that necessarily that doctors are thinking about it. The reason being is that there's this belief then that African Americans have a higher muscle mass, okay? And the muscle mass is leading to this creatine generation that is affecting this GFR score, okay? Again, there's this connection between race and genetics that doesn't exist, okay? So this is problematic. And the consequence then is that we're treating individuals as an average, right? We're not treating them as an individual, we're treating them as an average of their identified group, okay? So there's a lot of problems with using race as a proxy for genetics. So, this is the last slide, y'all, okay? We're here, all right? This is that evolutionary tree that I was talking about earlier, okay? Humans are down here, okay, we're way off in the corner, right? But you can see that we can track our ancestry backwards to a shared point with all other living things on Earth. Now, if you had a computer and access to this figure, you can actually click on all the different branches, and it's very fun. But, right, we can do this connection back. So, sort of in summary, right, we share our DNA and our ancestry with all the living things on Earth. At the DNA level, right, just to hit home a few points, two humans are 99.9% identical, okay? We can use our DNA to reveal relationships, right, between two individuals in the same species, between individuals in different species, but DNA cannot reveal race. Lines cannot be drawn between sociological race, okay, because humans like to migrate and reproduce, right? And race is commonly being used as a proxy for genetics, and it shouldn't be, okay? So, I was gonna ask you, what questions do you have? What are you gonna take away from this talk? How has all of this informed your view of your kinship with the humans around you, your kinship with life around you, right? So sort of what questions do you have? And as you're pondering those, you guys can have it up on the screen here. There's some really great resources out there. And one of the ones maybe the monastics here might be really interested in is, what does AAAO stand for? The American Association for Advancement of Science, right? They have two great groups that are very interesting. You might find interesting there. So, yes?
Okay, how does this relate to the Bible? It's the Garden of Eden in Africa.
Oh, man, that's a big question for a person who does not have her PhD anywhere near theology. My personal reading of the Bible is not a literal reading, but the Bible does discuss this ancestry and relationship among humans, right? So, I don't know that I can answer that question. If other people have thoughts on the subject.
Kate, could you just say something about just picking up that kind of question? Because it's back in the earlier on.
It's been a long talk,
was,
I hear you.
When the genome was being sequenced, et cetera, there were articles flying around in terms of a singular Eve, which is still a residue in some ways going back to the biblical account. And I'm just wondering where genetics is these days vis-a-vis the groupings that you were talking about in Africa.
Yeah, so this term of Eve is frequently used. There's a mitochondrial Eve and whatnot. So genetically speaking, I don't think we can be like, this is the genetics of the person that everybody shares their ancestry with. What's more likely the case, right, is that there is a small population of reproducing individuals that we can track our ancestry back to. But again, they would have been interbreeding and whatnot. So it's more likely a small group versus a single male and female, right? So, but we don't like know their DNA sequence or anything. Yeah.
The diagram you showed of the interrelationship of all living beings.
Yeah.
At one point, isn't that kind of like the Big Bang of living things?
Well, the Big Bang would have made it sound like this happened quickly, right? And it would have been a long time coming with a lot of extinctions along the way, right? But once life existed, I mean, on the grand scheme of how old the Earth is, it would have taken hold relatively quickly, right? Again, on the grand scheme of the Earth. It took a long time to get to that point of having that single cellular living organism that meets all the criteria of what we would call life. Because you can imagine that was quite the hurdle, okay? And once we got there, then things moved along relatively quickly. There have been large expansions in the number of species at different points, and there's also been multiple points where we've had a dramatic decrease in the number of species on Earth. But Earth seems to, or not Earth, life seems to exist in the craziest places, right? The bottom of the Mariana Trench, and also the tops of volcanoes, right? So life can exist in the deep, dark, high pressure, living off of methane instead of CO2, which is what our life is based in. Then it can also do hot and it's sulfur instead of a lot of carbon, and it's quite amazing the extremities that life can exist on this planet.
It's an interesting question about life elsewhere in the universe.
Oh man, I mean, I obviously don't have any deep, I don't have any secrets on this subject, but I believe that life has existed or will exist elsewhere in the universe and galaxies and whatnot. But
Do you think the closer to us, the more likely it is?
no, everywhere in the universe has the same ingredients as we originally had. And so there's no reason that would have to be like in our solar system or nearby. It would be cool if it was. But
Do you think Christ came to other places too and not just?
can I tell you, so she's getting deep. So I have taught FYS before, and I did it in the fall. We talked about just regular space exploration. But in the spring, I said, let's make the assumption that intelligent life exists on other planets. What does that mean for communication and psychology, whatever? But we also did theology. And I will tell you that there's actually been a lot written on this subject, on what that would mean for other religions if life did exist on other planets. For most religions, it seems to be A-okay, right? There's no major clash with life on other planets, but they will have very heated debates on whether or not Jesus coming here would have been good for all life, or if he would have had to multiple times. They're debating that one. Nobody knows. But if you want to know, there's resources out there. They've talked about it.
I read an article about somebody's theory that God has signed his name in our DNA. It's written in our DNA. And it is W-H-Y, Yahweh.
Okay.
Which is the Y stands for an individual Jewish word, each
Okay.
stands for, which I can't remember right now, what it was.
that specifically, I think one of the beautiful things about life and its expression of relationship is sort of what we touched on with like the fruit flies and stuff, the fact that there is so much similarity between us, and you can go to single-celled organisms, right? So baker's yeast, okay? There's a model organism highly used by scientists because of the massive amount of similarities. So if you're thinking of God being found in all of us and this shared sort of source, the DNA is certainly expressing that same idea, right? That there's this shared relationship across all of life, the similarity that we see in many things, but especially at the DNA level across all of living organisms. I mean,
Katie, thank you very, very much
yes,
for
thank you for staying
verifying.
so late.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.